China is about to become the kind of aviation market that can make or break an airplane program. And if you're Boeing, there's one uncomfortable thought you can't shake. What if the biggest wave of wide-body demand in modern history shows up, and your 787 Dreamliner doesn't get the call? Because this isn't just about which jet is better. It's about who controls the supply, who controls the politics, and who gets to decide what acceptable even means. And right now, China's answer is getting louder, sharper, and way more strategic than most people expected. The aircraft sitting at the center of that shift is COMAC C929, the wide-body that's being positioned to stare down the Dreamliner on Boeing's most important growth turf. And once you see how the pieces fit together, you'll understand why this could turn into Boeing's most painful market share fight of the next decade. China's passenger growth has been marching toward one obvious result, sooner than most people think. It becomes the biggest air travel market on the planet. That isn't hype. Every major forecast says the country's airlines will need massive fleet expansion, and Boeing itself has projected China will require thousands of new aircraft over the long run. And here's the part that matters. Wide bodies are the crown jewels in that story. They're expensive, high margin, and tied to the global routes that shape airline status. When a market gets that large, the question stops being who sells planes there, and becomes who gets to shape the rules there. That's why China isn't just shopping for jets, it's building leverage. And that's exactly where Boeing's problems begin. Because in China, Boeing isn't fighting just Airbus. It's fighting uncertainty, the kind you can't fix with a discount or a sales pitch. One month, the pipeline looks fine. The next month, headlines hit and deliveries get tangled in geopolitics. In 2025 alone, reports said Chinese airlines were told to pause Boeing deliveries during tariff escalation, and later reporting said Boeing resumed deliveries as tensions eased. That swing tells you everything. Access can change fast, and it can change for reasons Boeing can't control. Now, zoom out. Airbus already holds a powerful position in China, and Boeing's order momentum has been uneven for years. So even if the 787 is a strong jet on paper, Boeing still needs something else: consistent approvals, consistent deliveries, and a political climate that doesn't punish American hardware whenever relations go icy. And once a country decides it's tired of that vulnerability, it starts looking for a different plan. That plan didn't start as a purely Chinese project. It started as a partnership that looked almost too perfect. China had the money, manufacturing scale, and the market. Russia had decades of aerospace experience and engineering talent, plus a reason to play ball when sanctions tightened the screws. The idea was simple: co-develop a wide body that could compete in the same neighborhood as the Boeing 787 and Airbus A350 class. That's how the CR929 story was born through the China-Russia joint venture, but almost from the beginning, the partnership carried a quiet problem. Wide bodies are not like narrow bodies. You're not just assembling parts. You're negotiating power, intellectual property, and who gets credit for the brain of the airplane. Then geopolitics poured gasoline on the tension. Sanctions complicated Russia's participation, and industry reporting tied the program's slowdowns to work share and IP disagreements. Eventually, the relationship didn't just weaken, it snapped. Russia's role was downgraded, and it ultimately withdrew as a partner, with multiple outlets tying the brake to sanctions and the growing friction between the two sides. Most observers assumed that was the end of the threat. No Russia, no wide-body rival, right? Then COMAC changed the narrative. Instead of letting the project die quietly, COMAC relabeled it, pushed it forward under the name C929, and started framing it as China's own wide-body path. And then came the announcement that made people pay attention. COMAC said Air China would be the launch customer. That detail matters because Air China isn't just an airline, it's the national flag carrier. When a flagship carrier gets attached to a program like this, it's a signal flare. It says, this is no longer just an engineering effort. It's a national priority with institutional support. And if you're Boeing, you don't hear launch customer and think only about passenger seats. You think about momentum. You think about follow-in orders from other state-connected carriers. You think about how quickly a symbolic purchase can turn into fleet gravity, especially if policymakers start nudging the industry toward domestic options. But here's the catch. Naming a launch customer is easy. Delivering a wide body is the hard part, because the reality is, by public reporting, the C929 is still in the design journey. It's been described in detailed design stages, and the timeline stretches into the future. That means no one should pretend this jet is arriving next week to wipe out the 787. That's not how this works. So why is Boeing worried now? Because the threat isn't a perfect C929 tomorrow. The threat is what the C929 represents today, a pathway China can scale, protect, and prioritize even before it's fully mature. And the proof is in the supply chain moves. COMAC has been signing agreements with major foreign suppliers for systems tied to the C929, including deals reported with Safran and Crane. On one hand, that's what you do when you want credibility. Proven suppliers shorten development pain. They make certification more realistic. They help convince airlines the jet won't be a science experiment at 35,000 feet. But on the other hand, that's also a vulnerability. Because when your program depends on foreign components, foreign governments can squeeze it. Export controls don't need to be dramatic to hurt. A delayed system here, a restricted component there. And suddenly, production targets slip. Airlines lose patience, and confidence cracks. COMA knows this, and that leads straight to the biggest pressure point on the entire airplane. The engine. Engines aren't just hardware. They're sovereignty. They're the one part of the jet you can't easily swap without massive consequences. And in public reporting as recently as 2024, COMAC C's representatives said the C929's engine hadn't been chosen yet. That's huge because the engine decision locks in performance, maintenance ecosystems, and certification complexity. Years earlier, back when it was still the CR929, Reuters reporting described GE and Rolls-Royce as finalists. With engines like the GE-NX and Trent families being discussed, that's the easy route. Mature Western engines, global support networks. Fewer unknowns, but easy isn't always allowed. Not in a world where trade relationships can tilt overnight. So here's where the rumor machine goes wild, and we have to be careful. A lot of industry chatter suggests China ultimately wants a domestic engine solution for this class of aircraft. Some analysts point to a concept often labeled CJ2000 as a possible long-term direction. But the public details and timelines are not consistently confirmed across primary sources. In other words, you'll hear big claims online, but the only safe way to frame it is this. There's a strong incentive for China to eventually power a flagship widebody with a Chinese-built engine, but the path to that is long and technically brutal, and that's exactly why the C9 is such a clever strategic weapon even before it's done, because Boeing doesn't need to lose a head-to-head performance contest to lose market share. Boeing can lose simply by getting boxed out. Here's how that happens. A launch customer announcement becomes a prestige project. Prestige projects attract policy support. Policy support can reshape airline buying decisions in subtle ways: financing advantages, priority approvals, route incentives, long-term industrial planning. No one has to say ban Boeing for the market to tilt. It can tilt through 1,000 quiet decisions that all point the same direction: buy domestic when possible, and diversify away from a supplier that can get trapped in political storms. And once airlines start planning fleets around that assumption, Boeing faces a new kind of competition. Not one plane versus another, but one ecosystem versus another. Even if the first C929 deliveries take time, the planning cycle starts now. Airlines planned widebodies years ahead. Route networks, pilot pipelines, maintenance capacity, none of that flips instantly. So if a carrier believes China's widebody program is going to be protected and scaled through the 2030s, that belief changes their next order. And the next one, and the one after that. Meanwhile, Boeing's situation stays complicated. China has shown it can pause deliveries when tensions flare. Boeing has had to consider remarketing aircraft intended for Chinese customers when acceptance becomes uncertain. And each time that happens, it trains the market to think of Boeing as risky, even if the airplane itself is excellent. That's the part people miss. The C929 isn't threatening the 787 only as a machine. It's threatening it as a strategy. And if you want the cleanest way to understand the next decade of wide bodies in China, it's this. The country is building a future where long-haul growth doesn't require Western permission. where the flagship carrier can showcase a domestic widebody, where suppliers can be diversified, where politics don't decide whether planes arrive. Will the C929 truly match the 787 and a 350 on day one? That's a different question. Widebodies demand reliability, certification, and global support at a level that's hard to fake. And foreign systems plus engine uncertainty remain real hurdles that could slow everything down. But that doesn't erase the bigger point, because Boeing's real danger is losing the default position in the world's biggest growth market. And once you lose default status, winning it back is brutal. So the story isn't China built a Dreamliner killer and Boeing is finished. The real story is more subtle and honestly more dangerous. China is building optionality. It's building bargaining power. And it's building a widebody program that gives airlines a politically safer path, especially when relations are tense, and if the early 2030s really do become the moment China sits at the top of global passenger traffic. Then the question isn't whether Boeing wants to sell the 787 there. It's whether China still needs Boeing too, or keep the momentum and push this into the real reasons. The 787 could get squeezed in China, even if the C929 doesn't arrive perfect on day one. And the next clue isn't hidden in a press release. It's hidden in how airlines quietly plan fleets when politics can change overnight. Because when an airline buys a widebody, it's not buying an airplane for next month. It's locking in a decade of pilots, simulators, spare parts, maintenance contracts, route schedules, and resale value. That's why uncertainty is deadly. If a carrier even suspects deliveries could get interrupted, it starts asking a brutal question. What happens if we're stuck with planes we can't receive, can't service smoothly, or can't expand with later? That fear alone can tilt decisions away from Boeing and anyone ever publicly saying Boeing is banned. And here's where the C929 becomes a pressure tool, not just a product. Because the moment China has a credible domestic widebody path of in a slow one, it changes negotiations. Suddenly, Boeing isn't the only lever for long-haul growth. Airlines can point to the C929 and say, we have other options coming. Regulators can point to the C929 and say, we're building internal capability. And policymakers can point to the C929 and say, we're not dependent on anyone else. None of that requires the C929 to be fully mature today. It only needs to feel inevitable tomorrow. But Boeing's exposure in China goes deeper than politics. There's the timing problem. The 787 is a strong jet. But widebody customers don't just look at performance, they look at production stability and delivery confidence. If you're an airline planning 2030 routes, you want to know the manufacturer can hit schedules, handle quality demands, and keep the pipeline predictable. And when a market is as strategic as China, any wobble gets amplified. Every delay becomes a headline. Every hiccup becomes a C. This is why we need our own, and that plays perfectly into a domestic program's narrative. We may be newer, but at least we're ours. Now zoom into the part most viewers don't think about: certification and international acceptance. Even if the C929 becomes China's go-to widebody, exporting it is a whole different beast. Getting international certifications, getting global airline trust, building worldwide support, those are the walls that have stopped a lot of programs before. That's why foreign suppliers can be a shortcut, because proven systems make regulators and airlines less nervous. But it's also why geopolitics is such a threat. If export controls tighten, those same shortcuts can become chains around the program. So what happens next depends on which direction China pushes harder: speed with foreign tech, or independence with domestic systems. Either path still puts pressure on Boeing, just in different ways. If China prioritizes speed, the C929 becomes a serious domestic competitor. Faster, and Boeing gets squeezed in the place it needs growth most. If China prioritizes independence, the C929 might take longer, but it becomes a more powerful symbol and a stronger long-term threat, because it reduces outside leverage. And that brings us back to the engine, because the engine is the boss level of the whole story. A Western engine makes early certification and airline confidence easier, but it also creates dependency. A domestic engine promises independence, but it's a long, unforgiving road of testing, reliability, and proving you can run that power plant for years without nightmares in maintenance. This is where online speculation explodes, with people claiming timelines and performance numbers like they're already carved in stone. The smarter way to read it is simpler. Watch what COMAC commits to publicly, because once they choose the engine path, they're choosing the future they want for the C929. And here's the part that would make Boeing nervous. Even if the C929 takes time, China being named a launch customer isn't just one order, it's a starting gun. Because if the flagship carrier puts its name on the program, that's social proof inside the country. It signals safe to support, it makes it easier for other carriers to join later without looking risky or isolated. It makes leasing companies, suppliers, and training organizations pay attention. And once the ecosystem starts forming, the market can shift in slow motion, and then all at once. So the real danger for the 787 in China is a chain reaction first. A domestic widebody gets normalized. Then, support infrastructure builds around it. Then, the next fleet plan quietly allocates more slots to the domestic option. Then Boeing's share doesn't collapse overnight, just stops growing. And in a market expanding this fast, not growing is basically losing. Now, if you're watching this like a chess game, here's the part everyone should be tracking next. Not the hype clips, not the renders, not the proud speeches. Track the milestones that force reality. When does COMAC lock the final configuration? When does it freeze suppliers? When does the engine decision become official? When does a full-scale prototype timeline get anchored to a calendar? And most importantly, who follows Air China with real commitments? Because if you start seeing additional major Chinese carriers lining up behind the C929 early, that's not just a sales story. That's a political and industrial story. And it's the moment Boeing's 787 stops being the default widebody in the world's biggest growth market. And when that default flips, and here's where it gets even more interesting, because the C929 doesn't need to beat the 787 to hurt it. It just needs to change what Chinese airlines consider safe. Right now, every wide-body decision in China has an invisible second question attached. What happens if the political weather turns? If you're an airline, you can love an airplane and still avoid it if you don't trust the pipeline. Deliveries, spare parts, software updates, approve a CENI. One of those can get messy when governments start trading pressure. And once a carrier gets burned, even once, it starts building its future around one obsession: control. That's why the C929 is more than a jet. It's a bargaining chip with wings. Because the moment China can say, "We have our own wide-body path," it changes every negotiation. Boeing loses its strongest advantage, being the obvious option. And when you're no longer the obvious option, you get treated like a supplier, not a partner. Prices get pushed, timelines get questioned, and every deal turns into a test of leverage. But the real story isn't just what China is building, it's what China could do with it. Picture 3 futures, and in every one of them, Boeing feels the squeeze in the first future. The C929 becomes a national fleet anchor. It starts with a symbolic order, then grows quietly. Training centers pop up, maintenance ecosystems form, leasing and financing structures adapt. The plane doesn't have to be perfect, just good enough for domestic long-haul missions and key prestige routes. And once that infrastructure exists, it's easier to buy the next C929 than the first one. That's how market share changes without headlines. In the second future, the C929 becomes a pressure release valve. Even if it delivers slowly, it gives airlines and regulators something to point to when Boeing negotiations get tense. Every time Boeing wants a big commitment, the response becomes, "We'll see." We're also developing our own wide body. It drags leverage away from Boeing year after year. And in aviation, leverage is everything, because profits are thin and mistakes are expensive. And in the third future, the one Boeing fears most, the C929 becomes a policy magnet, not through public bans or dramatic announcements, but through incentives. Domestic aircraft get friendlier financing. Domestic fleets get smoother approvals. Domestic programs get priority attention. No one needs to say, "Don't buy Boeing." The environment simply makes the domestic option easier, safer, and more attractive. Now here's the twist that makes this whole situation feel almost unfair to Boeing. Even if the 787 stays the better-known product globally, China can still tilt its internal market toward domestic wide-bodies for one reason: strategic dependence. Airplanes aren't just transportation, they're national infrastructure. Long-haul routes move business power, tourism power, trade power, influence. And once a country decides that infrastructure should be protected from outside pressure, it starts acting accordingly, slowly at first, then decisively. This is also why the launch customer signal matters so much. When a flagship carrier puts its name on a domestic widebody, it's like a stamp that says, "This program isn't optional." It tells suppliers to align. It tells engineers the funding isn't going away. And it tells the rest of the airline industry that this isn't just a prototype, it's a national